ostatak ove tribine vodeći se na engleskom jeziku. Nadam se da to nikom neće biti.
Bliži mikrofon ruskima.
Dakle, ostatak ove tribine vodeći se na engleskom jeziku, nadam se da to nikome neće biti problem. Pa ću i predstaviti cenjene goste na engleskom. Želeo bih na srpskom da vas pozdravim sve u ime organizatora BeoKona, Udruženja ljubitelja fantastike Lazar Komorčić i Udruženja sa Hrabama. I would like to especially say hello to Brian Abel, Counselor for Political and Public Affairs of the Canadian Embassy. Of course, I would like to welcome one of the greatest living genre writers, Stiven Erikson. Our other guest is jedan. He is the Serbian translator of Malaška book of the Fall. I'm like a liar, so let's start. Stiven, you are, I truly believe that you're one of the greatest and best writers, especially fantasy, not only today, but in the history of the genre. And I think that in '99 you did a hell of a job with Gardens of the Moon, and it was something not seen before. You know, some stuff was perhaps glimpsed in the Martin's Game of Thrones, especially the military aspect, and the sort of grimness that is not today so much reality in the genre. But you yourself stated numerous times that your great inspiration was Black Book and Black Company books.
Yes.
Would you expand on that a bit?
Certainly. If I were to think of the fantasy genre in a very broad sense, Tolkien very much legitimized fantasy for a number of generations. But it was not until Stephen R. Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant that, at least to my mind, fantasy entered adulthood. But what I found with Glenn Cook is, in many ways, he took that adult approach and expanded upon it with a kind of dry and droll humor that was not present in a lot of fantasy, which tends to take itself very seriously.
Yeah.
And of course, having met Glenn now, I know that he's a veteran of the Vietnam War, and what he did with his fantasy was he took the sensibilities of the soldier from Vietnam, American soldier, and simply transposed it into a fantasy setting where magic took the place of napalm and bombs from the sky. And he created a storyline that was about the soldiers on the ground. So it was a very human level, not kings, queens, princesses, nobles, or people, children with lost birthrights and all the rest, which is a fairly common tropes amongst fantasy. But he actually humanized it in a much more, I guess, contemporary fashion, and that was a huge inspiration for me.
I'd like to expand on that. I've had contacts with many veterans, especially American ones, who drowned themselves in military fantasy and military SF. So what was, especially the Vietnam era guys, you know, in fact Robert Jordan was the veteran of the American War, Vietnam War. So what was, I don't know, kind of very hard for me to fathom is why would someone who survived, you know, the bombings and the trenches and foxholes, why would someone seek escapism in a similar but more gruesome literary experience? And is, in fact, fantasy escapism, as it's frequently implied by the mainstream critics and media?
First of all, I don't know if fantasy is as much escapism as it used to be. We've certainly done away with the cliched approach of good versus evil. The thing I think that I've studied a lot of literature from veterans, American veterans of the Vietnam War, and I think it's sort of revisioning in a fantasy setting is actually quite apt and quite appropriate. Many of these people will talk about just how surreal that war was for them. And I think that that element of the surreal lends itself very easily to the fantasy genre.
You yourself an anthropologist and an archaeologist. So, and we had our own Vietnam-like experience not that long ago. And 5 years ago, I did an interview with Steve Sterling. He's also a Canadian writer. He lives in US, and he does a lot of military stuff.
Alternate histories.
And alternate histories, yeah. I really like his change series. And I asked him, he's a historian of sorts, you know, and I asked him about that particular, about that particular point of view that is perhaps unique when seen through the eyes of the Westerner and through the eyes of the fantasy creator, you know. And you're dealing a lot with ancient rivalries and a lot of ethnic, especially in the Seven Cities region, you know, a lot of ethnic clashes and the clash of civilizations, and in fact, the whole expansion of the Malaška Empire. It reads sort of like, I'm sorry, the night is dark and full of spoilers. It almost reads like a combination of Pax Romana and Pax Americana. But there are a lot of...
And Pax Britannia.
Yeah. But there are a lot of hotspots in our world that, in a weird sort of way, seem almost fantastical, you know. And do you have a view on that? Do you try to touch some of those questions in your writings? Or do you think it's too sensitive of a matter to approach?
I don't know about sensitivity. I think all conflicts have multiple angles and multiple sides. And as an anthropologist, of course, one tends to deal with the notion of cultures in contact and cultures in conflict. The two tend to often be synonymous. And so fantasy in a broader sense is a kind of mythologizing of a cultural history in some fashion or another. So when I'm approaching cultures in conflict, I do want to see and explore both sides, or many sides as I can of that conflict. And I hope that it establishes a balance, and it realizes that or the reader can realize that there is a humanizing element to both sides. And quite often what conflict involves is dehumanizing the enemy.
The reason why I asked you this is one of the most, for me, important and almost heart-wrenching encounters in Malaška when Kalon reached Susret, the Empress of Sea.
Yes.
Yeah, and he decided, in fact, to spare her. He saw all of the events, the demise of the bridge builders, the demise of the Second Army. He saw it through her eyes and glimpsed the greater game in question. And that was, I think, one of the most pivotal moments of the series, at least for me. You know, so. But let's get back to 1999. So it was half an hour ago we talked about the fantasy writers in terms of generations and in terms of when they approach the field. So during the 90s, my view is that there is fantasy of the 80s, and that during the 90s fantasy changed, and then there's the fantasy of the new millennia. And I think that Robert Jordan is perhaps the last writer of the 80s and the first writer of the 90s, and then you have George Martin, of course, who sort of changed the genre, and then there's writers like you, like fantasy by Richard Morgan, there's Greg Keyes, there's a slew of authors that came slightly before this new grimdark period of fantasy. So was it hard for you to sell to publishers Gardens of the Moon? Was it? Did you have to tell them, you know, look, there's Jordan, there's Martin, there's Terry Goodkind, you know, there are other guys with huge door-stopping books, you know. What was your approach?
Well, it took 8 years to find a publisher for Gardens of the Moon.
And they were finished 1991, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And when I sent the manuscripts originally to two U.S. publishers, Del Rey and Tor, in each case, the manuscript sat for, well, the first time 18 months and the second one 22 months. So the manuscript had reached the final decision phases within the editorial board at those publishers. And in both cases, the manuscript was returned to me, and the editorial comments were to the effect of, this is too many characters, too complicated. I always found that to be somewhat offensive to the American readers, because as far as I'm concerned, they are as sophisticated as any other reader. But I basically had to put the book on the shelf. Eventually, I moved to the UK and approached UK publishers, and that's how we found our footing. And even then, I had already finished the third novel by the time we finally convinced Tor to take a second look, and they bought the rights for the US.
My feelings are that UK fantasy and publishers are kind of very much defined by Tolkien and his legacy in a way that they seek to differentiate themselves from it. You know, there's a much more Tolkien-like fantasy in US. UK writers are almost always trying to do something different, unique. So you have Gaiman, you have recently Tchaikovsky with his bugs in all kinds of shapes.
Absolutely, and I think to a large extent what drew the British publisher to Gardens of the Moon was that it's a fairly postmodern kind of approach to fantasy. And so I'm setting up tropes that you would expect in Tolkien-style fantasy, and then I'm plugging them one after another through that series.
Yeah, you mentioned that it was sort of convoluted for the publishers, but I'm interested to know from a translator's point of view, was it hard to deal with such a plethora of characters with such unique concepts such as Warrens and very unique type of magic? How did you manage to do that alchemy of translating from one language to another?
It wasn't easy. I have a book where I write everything down, every character, so I don't forget their names, how they speak.
Can I have that book? So I forget their names.
Sure. It's a must, so it's really vast, and it wasn't easy, but you know, step by step, one item at a time. So
do you get scared when confronted with such a huge number of pages? I know I do.
I was. With the first two, yeah. But by the third, it was, oh, another Stiven Erikson book. Yeah, I'll do it. So
you have a favorite one?
I have two.
Yeah.
Yeah. The first one is Gardens of the Moon.
Yeah.
Of course. It's very cinematic. It's very cinematic. It's very diverse. It was new. It was very different from everything I read so far. First one being Beokon. So if I really Tolkien again, I will say, wow, this is great. That's Guardians of the Moon for me. The second one is, well, Towards the Hounds, maybe. I have three. I have also three. That House Gates.
Yeah.
It was heart-wrenching, and I'll never forgive you for the whole thing.
So is Coltain your favorite character in the series?
I don't have a favorite character in the series, which is very interesting.
Yeah,
I don't have a favorite character because it's very difficult with your books. You start to like a character and then you say, ah, shucks, he's spoiled. He's like us. He's good and bad. He's great. And you hate the character, like in Pan and Domin, and you hate it, and then you realize, okay, he's again like us. He's great. He's not white or black, good or evil. Circumstances, chance, who knows what.
Yeah, so I had an interesting conversation with my mother. She does not read in English, but she very much loves fantasy in Serbia. And when the fourth book came out, she was very angry, with the book, and she stopped reading it for a while. And I asked her, so what's up, And she told me, and she has a thing, she does not remember the names of particular books. It's all the same to her. The titles do not matter. So I've asked her, have you read the House of Change? She said, I don't remember which one was that. Is that? Yeah, I don't like it. Why? Well, there's this, a poor guy from a village, from a backwater village, and his parents are so mean to him, and he's so misunderstood. And his contact with civilization is so bad. A kid from a little village going to town and having such a dreadful experience, and it was so difficult for me.
Who is that?
It's Karsaro. I was like, are you insane? I have 50% of your chromosomes, I need to get checked out. So, and it was really an eye-opener for me. There's this 50-something-year-old woman who sees Karsaro as a kid from a village that's traumatized by civilization.
Wow.
So, extraordinary. Well, yeah.
Did she get to the part with the rape and everything?
Let's just say that my childhood was not easy. So I'm interested to know, did you have such a diverse view amongst your readers on certain characters? My favorite ones are, well, I was a long time fan of Whiskey Jack, but I think that Korlat is my favorite and the saddest, and I know the greatest character. But somehow she's missed by most of the readers, and when I talk to other fans about her, they are kind of like meh, and there are a lot of those who consider Whiskey Jack to be kind of Ned Stark of the series, but there are also completely different views about him. There are those who find Anamander to be some kind of Superman, and there are those who call him Antidrist, just a mean guy who's brooding and has a big sword. Is he compensated for something? And so, do you get that a lot?
I do, and oddly enough, some of the characters I'm the most proud of in terms of creation are the least liked characters in the books. Felicity Younger, for example.
Oh yeah. She's such
a traumatized character.
Yeah, I was totally going to say that.
The other one is in the third book, the character of the Maid, who produces the child, who becomes Silver Fox. that entire story. I mean, the thing with fantasy is it's the only genre where you can take a metaphor and make it real.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to explore with that character was postpartum depression. And so quite often the experience of postpartum depression, from what I've listened to and heard from people, they have a resentment for their child in the sense that it is stealing their youth, it is stealing their energy, and the child is stealing their lives. And so I manifested that magically in the third book, Memories of Ice, of a child who is growing magically fast by drawing on the life force of the mother of that child. But generally, most readers cannot stand her. They simply describe her as endlessly whining and complaining. Well, I mean, if you're aging 10 years for every 6 months, I'm sure you would complain as well. So,
True.
yeah.
But it all worked out, kind of.
Kind of, yeah, it worked out. Yeah.
So, I would like to touch upon that a bit and to expand it. Fantasy is great, in my opinion, because there is very rarely racism in it. Let's put aside all the objections towards Tolkien and his portrayal of Southerlings and Easterlings and Otherlings. Yeah, but in modern day fantasy, it's very hard to have such racist tropes, as in.
Really?
I don't know. Well, I think so.
Okay, what about a Eurocentric story that is basically the War of the Roses? That has the barbarians to the north, that has the dark-skinned hordes to the east.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. To me, as I'm a white guy from the Balkans, I would probably be accepted in SS like that. I don't see it as racism. I see it as a story. But you yourself are from a different kind of civilization, where you have all the North America has a lot of immigrants, and you're confronted by other skin colors and other civilizations, and you yourself use many colors when describing your characters.
Yeah.
And there are blue humans, and for me it took me, I don't know, my 6th or 7th reading of the entire series, because whenever a book is published, I read through all of them. So yeah, I have no life.
I should do that.
So it took me 6th or 7th reading, and Ian Asimov's novels, to realize that in fact the late emperor is black. I never imagined him to be so, And
a number of characters are. Kalam.
Yeah. Well, okay, Kalam, Quick Ben.
Yeah, Traveler.
I was. That was sort of implied by their backstory, by their origin of the 7 cities. I sort of automatically imagined them like sort of Arabic, but the emperor, the Shadow Throne, was never in my. Well, I did not ever imagine him to be of any color. He was sort of shadow-like figure. So I was kind of shocked by that, and I started to question myself: is that view racist in any way, or is it just the fact that I am simply not used to see colors in the world around me? So, did you in any way try to tangle those issues like racism, sexism in your novels, or did you
Absolutely,
just write the story?
No, it was a very, very conscious decision on our part. Remember I'm saying this is postmodernist, so in a sense, the series is actually taking a look at the fantasy genre, even as it's partaking in the fantasy genre. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's actually looking back on the genre and all the tropes that are very prevalent in the genre. And of course, that Eurocentric approach has been very dominant in fantasy for a long time. And so we wanted to write against that, quite quite deliberately writing against it. So we created a very multicultural approach to things.
But you did it in a way that it's not obvious. It's almost like...
Okay, I'm going to get to that. I'm getting to that, yeah. You see, we define magic as a force in culture and civilization that was attainable through discipline exclusively.
A great equalizer.
Yeah, it is not only an equalizer, but it's a liberator. So then we realized, well, and I'm saying we because it's me and Ian Estamont, we're co-creating this world, fellow archaeologists and anthropologists. And so we thought, well, what will be the effect of magic on, say, a late Iron Age, sort of end of the Roman Empire style, technological level civilization? What would the effect of that kind of magic be? And it occurred to us immediately is that it's not only an equalizer, but it's a liberator. And so it is the Malayan world is a world without sexism and without racism. But we didn't want to signpost that. We didn't want to be waving and pointing fingers at it in terms of the contrast with our world. So that we basically removed racist and sexist language from our approach, from our style of writing.
Let me ask you on this. Modern day racism is in fact very modern day. You know, there were several black-skinned Roman emperors.
Yeah, and think of Byzantiums, especially.
There is whole dynasty of Syrians
and Armenians and all the rest.
Yeah. So but in a way, the magic and the gods were real to them, you know. So your plethora of ascendants and gods, are they in a way? Do they come from the cultures? Are they created by the faithful or influenced by them? That is a pretty common trope in fantasy. Or do they influence cultures?
Well, and that's one of the themes that runs through the entire series is even the gods don't know whether they are the ones I guess, rewarding the faithful, or if the act of faith itself is what gives them power.
Chaining them.
Yeah, and chaining them, absolutely. So they are being pushed and pulled by their believers.
Yeah.
And that is probably a fairly different approach in terms of pantheons and religion in general.
Well, in a way, it's a pretty standard D&D trope. In fact, that if a god loses the faithful, he dies.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. So.
I switched to GURPS fairly early.
Yeah. So and that we come to that, you know, many fantasy series, successful ones, were a product of role-playing games. There's Raymond Feist with his series, starting with The Magician. And by the way, have you ever read his middle series, Shadow Snake Wars? Serpent Wars. Yeah. No. It's a great military fantasy. Oh, right. And he tackled some issues that you did in the seventh book, you know, economy and stuff like that. But anyway, there's Wild Cards, science fiction series by George Martin and other authors, and Roger Zelazny. There's Raymond Feist. There's Steven Brust, yeah, great author. There's Wheel of Time, in fact. You know? And it could be argued that even Lord of the Rings, because it grew from the storytelling of Tolkien to his son, was kind of role play. You know, I can't simply imagine a father and his young boy talking about elves and magic and without some background info. Yeah. And I was totally flabbergasted when you told me that most of that role playing was done solely by you and Ian. Yeah. And as a long time and game master and the player, you know, that was mind blowing. How did that work? You know, that's so hard to.
I don't know how. I mean, we would alternate, and so whoever was running that campaign was the GM for that night, and the other, the player, would usually carry about 3 characters.
Oh yeah?
Yeah. And quite often, an entire night's gaming was simply conversation between characters. And of course, we're both in a writing program at the same time and living in the same townhouse in Victoria. So we could spend a lot of time doing this. And we tended to game in a very narratorial fashion. So we were narrating a story, and then the characters would, the other player would take on the characters and basically drive through that story. And we appreciated what we were up to at the time because it's a great humbling experience for a writer to, if you think of yourself as the writer being the narrator in control of all your characters and all the rest, what gaming does, what role-playing gaming does, is it takes the characters out of the author's control.
Yeah.
And that is a fantastic experience for a writer, because quite often beginning writers will try to force their characters into their story and continually force them. And characters resist. They resist these things. And so gaming really allowed us to really relax with that notion that a character can take the story almost anywhere, and you have to run with it.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask one more question before we let you rest a bit. So, is there any Malazan character who is in fact a former PC?
Lots of them.
Yeah, I've read somewhere that Callum was in fact your PC.
No, that was Cam. That was Ian.
Yeah.
I was the NPC and I played Dancer.
Oh.
Cotillion.
Yeah.
I played Krupp.
Yeah.
Let's see, the NPCs there were Baruch, the alchemist. Who else did I play? I played Ralak Nom with the assassin.
It's a team for you, isn't it?
Is it? It might be. It might be. Yeah, that's true. But the very first character I played, because I came late to gaming. We were on a dig in the wilderness in northwest Ontario when Cam started running games. Was Anomander. That was one of my characters. So I had Anomander and Kaladin were the 2 characters that I pretty much started with.
Oh yeah, Anomander.
Yeah, as like a 17-year-old. So
yeah. So then. I'm a translator as well, so I know how much painful sometimes it gets to sift all those informations through your brain and put it on like keyboard on the screen. So can you tell us something about your work process? Do you work nights? Do you work better at the morning? Is there any sort of rhythm, and does it depend on whose viewpoint you're channeling at the moment? On which characters do you work on in the novels? How does that work?
I do have a routine. You have to have a routine with a big book, not a long book, a big book, like the Malazan series. Mornings and evenings. I don't choose the viewpoints, I just roll with it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it goes faster, sometimes it goes slower. Afternoons are the worst, but sometimes you have to do it because of the deadline. But mornings and evenings are the best time for translating, for me.
Yeah.
Especially the night.
Yeah, I'm almost exclusively night. So,
I personally think that's the most creative part of the day. For me.
Do you rely a lot on internet? There's a lot of info
yes.
in those books, and it's highly compressed. And there are sometimes hints which are especially maddening for me. Author would hint something at the book 3 and explain it in the book 7, and you need to meanwhile you need to translate it, and you need to know who's
doing what,
and what sex is it, because we have
a change of sex in a number of
Yeah. Got a few of those.
I have this book I mentioned. I have the internet. I have friends who read it. So please, can you just tell me what was the guy's name, or what did he do? I asked you a question. I usually translate a book by not reading it first. I allow it to influence me as a reader. As a reader, I am a big reader, and I like to read books. And what this did to me is that I had to read all of them up front.
Right.
and
this is something that stole some of the creativity.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing with me. I've translated, I think, 100 something, various novels, comic books, something. And I've never ever read again anything I've ever translated, either in Serbian or in English. Somehow it's almost as if I've burned out a part of the brain where that book was shelved. How is it with you?
I have to reread it.
Yeah, well, that's because you're working on it, you know, but do you enjoy it when you get back to it?
I do, but it's different. It's just like rereading a book. Well, not exactly, but kind of the same. I go back to those characters, and I think that's one of the reasons I don't have a particularly favorite character, because I revisit them.
Next question.
I revisit them again and again, and I see them from different points of view. I see something I missed the first reading, or the second, or the third, and yeah, sometimes I do that. Yeah.
So, Stiven, do you ever read your books after they're published, not for research reasons, but for enjoyment's sake?
No. And one of the reasons was when Gardens of the Moon came out, and then we ended up with a book deal that involved not being paid by the book, but being paid yearly.
Yeah.
So I was paid 4 times a year for 9 years to complete the series. And so I literally did not have time to go back to read. I was writing a book a year. And you know, if the book is 320,000 words, believe me, you don't have time for anything else.
There's a common perception here that you guys are paid by the gold, and that's the reason why those books are so long.
I wish. No, not at all.
Yeah, so we mentioned sort of Pax Americana, Romana Britannia. We can add it Russia as well, and their expansion towards the east and Siberia. So all the empires tend to look alike after some years or centuries unfold. But my view of Malazan Empire is essentially a force for, well, not exactly good, but a force for law. In perhaps Hockean way of law versus the chaos. And I felt that your archaeological and classical education was influencing you there. You took civilization side against the savagery, barbarism, against the wilderness. You know, there is that duality, I think, in Malazan books. You have civilizations with its laws and roads and you know, buildings and armies, and on the other side there are forces who tear all of that down, from those who are perhaps unconscious of what they're doing, such as Icarium, to those who are almost a condensed force of savagery, such as Karsa. And you, in fact, have published an essay about Karsa. It seemed to me that you are not offended, but confused by his popularity with the readers. You know, he's a sort of high school bully who would, you know, bully people like us, you know, geeks who read. You know? And those same geeks who read are worshipping him almost. Is my view on that anywhere close to being correct?
I guess. Karsa's a curious character. Karsa was sort of my approach to the Conan style barbarian.
Yeah.
You know, people, I think there was a panel earlier on Grimdark, and I've certainly commented on Grimdark a fair bit in recognizing that there's nothing new in modern Grimdark. It was probably, its origin comes from sword and sorcery,
Yeah.
and probably Robert E. Howard is
Yeah.
the progenitor of Grimdark. And of course, if you look biographically at Robert E. Howard, he was a person who rejected civilization out of hand, and had a very nihilistic view of civilization as a corrupting force to the nobility of the savage. And of course, as an anthropologist, you realize very quickly that
there's nothing more noble than to die as childbirth and
well, yeah, I mean,
yeah.
there is no implicit or inherent nobility in I guess, in cultural ways of living that are non-technological.
Yeah.
And so Karsa was very much a kind of, I guess, again, a postmodern take on Conan. And really recognizing that there is a, you know, from his culture, he has a very, very specific point of view that drives his decision-making process throughout the entire series. But it does evolve with time as the more educated he becomes, the more aware he becomes of the complexity of the outer world.
There's perhaps also the witch that accompanies him and it constantly nags at him, and is she sort of like Jiminy Cricket of course?
Kind of, yeah. She's going to challenge his assumptions. At the same time, I don't really have a particular opinion on civilization, and so Karsa stands in for me as the person who questions the things that we take for granted and the assumptions we make regarding how societies work.
A guy asked me, because I've read all the books so long ago, and there's a guy who's just starting to read them. Well, he's, I know, up to 8, I think, and he asked me, okay, why does he not simply kill her? You know, she nags at him, and she's constantly by his side, and he's so powerful. He's a force of nature who stands up to gods, you know, and there's this woman who is, they're almost like an old married couple.
Aren't they just?
Yeah, and why does he not, he has all the power in all the worlds, and why does he suffer through that?
Well, it's not really suffering, is it? I mean, the one of his sort of characteristics that evolved through time. He starts out as a naive but very powerful character, and that naivety often works to his advantage because he becomes fearless, facing various oppositions that most people would run from. But as one matures, especially if they remain powerful, that maturity invokes a kind of wisdom in when do you use power and when don't you. And throughout that series, as it extends onwards, he becomes much more constrained in his use of power. And to me, that is simply maturity on his part.
And it's not influenced by her in any way?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, okay. So, I mentioned Durkok and you mentioned Howard, and there was a dialogue in the 60s, I think, in the, I don't remember the name of the paper, the magazine. It was a dialogue between Murkog and Fritz Leiber about the nature of the genre, and that's the point in time when some things were defined and given names, and names tend to have the power of their own over the subject matter, you know. And so Murkog coined the name sword and sorcery, and Fritz Leiber coined the name epic fantasy. And that was, I think, the moment of perhaps genre adolescence. You know, and there are a lot of questions about how to, in fact, name this genre. And there was, I think the guy's pronounced Flute. Yeah. So he proposed that we use, in fact, Slavic word fantastika as umbrella term for all the sub-genres and stuff like that. So, and the most common idea is that sword and sorcery is character-driven. It's smaller in scope, and perhaps grimmer and that epic fantasy is more concerned by world building than with character development as such.
Right.
But there are series that, in my view, strand both of those worlds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that your series, although today it's most commonly thrown in the grimdark, basket, I think that it stands in sword and sorcery category and in epic fantasy equally well. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, yeah, my stuff's not grimdark, as it's commonly defined. I know John Clute, and I've talked to him about this, but we are going to continue the conversation, or maybe the argument, because I don't buy his definitions. I don't think they're valid anymore. I think times have changed. One of the things that happens in academia is, okay, you have to imagine your classic fantasy geek at 18, 19, 20, whatever, going into university, studying literature, or at least English department of some form or another, but always loving fantasy and science fiction. All of the works that they fell in love with stay with them, and then as they become academics, and then you start legitimizing courses like fantasy and science fiction in universities, these now professors will take their first loves and bring them into the classroom.
Sorry, did that happen with Lovecraft?
With Lovecraft? Probably, yeah. In any case, so they take them in there, and then they end up teaching those particular subjects and those particular books to the next generation of potentially academics in fantasy and fantastic. So what happens is you have a generational lag behind what is being taught and what is out there right now. And I go to the International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts. I've been going for 10 years now, where academics come and deliver papers on fantasy, science fiction, artwork, you name it, television, film. And within fantasy, especially, you'll still get papers on Moorcock, Elric, for example, or on Tolkien, but you won't get papers on Mark Lawrence or Joe Abercrombie, because these people have not actually read the modern fantasy, and their specialty is actually 20 or 30 years out of date.
Yeah.
And it's very, very frustrating, and I've given talks at that conference. I'm going to be guest of honor this year, and I may talk to it again at the luncheon. And you can talk to the academics and they will tell you, well, I just don't have the time to read a 10-book series or a 3-book series. And they're right, they don't, because academia now is so much more administratively overbalanced that they simply do not have the time. And so Clute's dynamics, to me, are still looking at fantasy of the 60s at the latest.
Yeah.
Maybe early 70s, mid-70s. And so it is not as relevant as it is now. Because certainly my stuff, I grew up with sword and sorcery and epic fantasy, and I just blended the two without even thinking about it.
Do you consider certain authors from the 80s, such as Glenn Cook, we've mentioned him, being relevant today? Roger Zelazny, perhaps, or he's kind of a big deal here. So, do you find some of that being relevant even now?
Sure.
Or
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Glenn Cook stuff I think remains as relevant as ever. I'm aware that Zelazny's Amber series is heading to television, is that right?
yeah,
There's rumors of it? That would be great, that would be fantastic. Yeah. Great writer.
Do you consider him to be sword and sorcery or epic fantasy, for instance?
Neither. He's writing fantasy as far as I can tell. I wouldn't try to narrow it down.
Yeah. So, are there any questions by the audience? We're going to take some, and then we'll continue the answers. So, yeah.
Well, I have several, but I'll start small.
Yeah,
One question. Okay, the most important to me right now, I just try to tie into something you talked about earlier, that you role-played your characters. And I'm just right now, I started recently, and I'm here at a time where Theo and Bug are introduced into the story. I thought book. And I'm just fascinated by their dialogue, and I was wondering, how did that dialogue come to fruition? Did you role-play it, or how? Because
no, they are not role-played. I think for the later books, Cam had already moved off to Alaska, and I was living in various places. But I did run a number of games with about 5 players. And those players basically comprised Fiddler's Squad in the Bone Hunters, in that army. So Tar and Smiles and Bottle were all played by various people, and each of them I dedicated a particular novel to. No, Tahol and Bug were entirely fictitious inventions.
Yeah, okay, we had a question here then. You?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I guess it's also studying anthropology. I'm just curious, what inspired you for the curious pantheon, I guess? Pantheon is actually really interesting. It has been very interesting ever since the Gardens of the Moon, since it's really connected both to magic, but it also has a sort of dimension of its own, like with the elder gods and the burned and the chain god. Apparently, there's like pantheons for the pantheon. What inspired you for that? There aren't any cultures I know of which have like layered, I suppose.
You could argue that many of them did. I mean, one of the traditional sort of interpretations, say for the Norse mythologies, is a combination or a blending of 2 very distinct tribes, if you will, the Aesir and the Vanir. And so the gods of the Vanir would be Frey, Thor, and a few others. And anyways, then the Aesir would be Odin and Tyr, I guess. So maybe Balder, I'm not sure. But anyways, that idea, it's probably out of date now, but it was an idea that was prevalent of 2 distinct cultures blending or merging, and then their pantheons doing the same. And so for the Malazan stuff, it is just, for us, a question of layering through time and identities being lost as cultures fade and new ones rise.
Okay, we got a question here. Yeah.
You made a comment about the state of the scholarship regarding the fantasy genre today. So it seems that the scholarship lags behind real fiction. So what would be like the best or most interesting issues or directions or topics that fantasy-related scholarship should explore nowadays?
Curiously enough, I know of one PhD thesis that actually discussed the influence of role-playing games on fantasy. And that position is met with blank looks by most of the people at ICFA, because they are not aware of the influence of role-playing games and Dungeons & Dragons specifically. And they see it as a derivative sidelight of the Tolkien style of fantasy. But it is it is defining itself as a very, very huge influence, post-Tolkien, on fantasy. And we don't see very much of that being discussed.
Okay.
I have a question.
What about characters? What happens about with the characters that you stop playing? So, the very long series, at some point, there's still characters around that have been played by you or Cameron. So, what happened to them? How did you decide their fate? And was it just a conversation that you had? Okay, this is where they should be going, or how did you decide?
Sometimes they just sort of fade away, but others, their fates were actually role played out. One of the best examples is in Toll the Hounds. I won't try to spoiler it too much, but we actually played out the confrontation between Traveller and Rake. And you may not believe this, but the entire fate of which character would survive was based on who rolled clean 20 first. And so it could have gone obviously either way, and that would have changed the entire story.
What about Gruntle, for example?
Gruntle? Fictional character, simply made up.
Never played.
Yeah, no one played. Yeah.
When we're talking about characters, I was one of the moments, although it was telegraphed ages ago, one of the moments when I was really angry with you was Whiskey Jackson Lee. I knew what would happen.
Pretty obvious foreshadowing, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was so obvious. But we were talking earlier about the characters who live the lives of their own, and did you want it to do that, or was he simply, too set in ways, all general, and he wanted to do that?
Who do you mean by he?
I mean, Whiskey Jack.
Oh, right.
Is his decision not to get treatment for his knee?
Right.
Was that his decision as a character, or was it yours as an author, as a demi?
That's a hard one to separate out. And I can't really recall one way or the other. I suspect I wanted to nail home fairly early on that every character was at risk of dying. And remember, I was doing this in 1991. This is long before George Martin pulled out the machine gun and just took it out on everyone. So, but yeah, I wanted that sense of jeopardy.
Was there any questions in this area?
Here, though.
Yeah, we didn't have anyone.
So I've got a question about Bottle.
Bottle, okay.
Yes. He's the old school Yucatan warlock type, whatever, and I was wondering how did he get his name? I assume it was Raven Tooth.
Yeah, it was Braven Tooth. But you see, all of that convention of naming, we will point straight to Glenn Cook for that. And for the Glenn Cook stuff, the naming convention among the U.S. Marines in the Vietnam War is actually where Glenn Cook got his stuff from. So if you look at some of the early, or some of the best of the Vietnam War literature, for example, The Short Timers by Gustav Password, which was then made into the Kubrick film, Full Metal Jacket, and the lead character's name is Joker. This is where it all comes from. It all comes from that particular, I guess, culture, if you will.
And this is a great moment to ask the translator, did he have a trouble with all those nicknames and their meanings? And was it just a pun, play on words, or did
You cannot imagine. You can, yeah. It was difficult for some, extremely difficult for others, and sometimes it just comes to you. So sometimes I have this gathering of friends, and I say, okay, this character is like this, and he does this, and we have name number 1 and name number 2, or nickname. So which is better?
And do you ever completely change the name in the original? Because it's so much conceptually better to use a different word with different meaning, but that it reflects the truthness of the character. Do you ever do stuff like that? For instance, he is called a knife and you use dagger. It's two completely different objects, similar, but...
Sometimes we have similar names, like sorry, sorry. It is very important to get their essence.
Yeah.
So I try to stay within the essence of the name, within the essence of the world, the background. And I did a completely opposite thing. There's a character, Kilava, which in Serbian means something different. It actually means something.
What does it mean?
Weak.
Weak?
Yeah.
I like that.
I changed it. I just changed it to Kilava. So she didn't have a meaning to her name at that point.
But you see, that's interesting because quite often I would name characters using almost as irony. So, you know, for example, in some of the Beokon Cobra Brooch novellas, there's a character named Tiny Chanter, and he's about 9 feet tall. So I often undercut that.
We have smiles.
You have smiles, exactly. Who never smiles?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to another question. Yeah, way back there. Yeah, you. Near the pillar. Yeah.
So, a while back I was reading Midnight Tides, and being an idiot, I decided midway through the book to look at like the internet, you know, various forums. And I accidentally found out Buck's real identity.
Right.
I'm not trying to spoil anything.
Yeah.
So, and while I was, you know, when I continued reading the book, I found just a huge amount of references and like foreshadowing about his identity.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what is the process like when you write a book? Like, do you already beforehand have the entire story, you know, plotted out, or do you like, how does it work? How do you make that happen?
Yeah, I certainly knew Buck's identity, and so I could foreshadow and play around linguistically with hinting to the reader without them knowing it. Which, of course, is what writers do, is torture you, basically. And we take great pleasure in doing so as well, I should tell you. And yeah, translators as well. So yeah, it's that kind of stuff. Once you've set it up, then of course you know more than the reader does, and it's all up to you to decide what goes in and what you keep out. Most of the novels, I had the endings of those novels in mind, and so writing was simply a process of starting on page 1 and getting to that ending, and working out how am I going to get to that ending. And for the 10th novel, the final novel, I'd say almost the last 150 pages of that novel, and the main scenes and main events that occur there, were all in my head long before I even finished Gardens of the Moon. So they sat there for, well, 19 years, if you think about it, just waiting for me to get to them. And that was hard. That was very hard to hold back.
Do you have contacts with any translators all over the world? How many languages?
I get panicked emails all the time. Germany, yeah, everywhere.
Yeah. When you mentioned Germany, some of your names are kind of Germanic. Dragnipur, you know, it's
That's canned.
yeah.
Nothing to do with me.
Yeah. Any questions here? Yeah.
I wanted to ask, where you find inspirations for characters Duiker and Beokon?
My inspirations for them?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, historian. Well, there were a number of historians that traveled with Alexander during his conquest of the Indus Valley and all the rest. And so that was partly it. But I needed a point of view that could give us context beyond simply who wins the battles, etc. And so Duiker was very much that kind of point of view. Ikovian, no, that one just sort of organically grew out of the character. I came up with this mercenary company and gave them very archaic speech and mannerisms and titles, shield, anvil, and distride, and all the rest. And then that just sort of pushed me towards defining what is a shield anvil, what is a distride, and that led me to Kobe.
What about poetry? You have a lot of poetry in Malazan series. That's of course a thing that Tolkien did, but it's pretty rare, in fact. And most fans that I talk to, they sort of dislike having poetry in their fantasy. So, why did you do it? Is it something that you like to do, write poetry?
Not only that, I knew that a lot of readers were just going to skip past it, and there's so much stuff in that poetry that actually is telling you what is about to happen.
You have favorite line in any of this, not only poetry. If you would have to choose one sentence, one line from the entire 10 books.
Easy, easy. The sea does not dream of you.
Yeah, okay. Mine is always an even trade sorceress.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we had a question here. I think I'll put behind you. Anybody? Okay, you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, so you mentioned the entire series is sort of a commentary, a postmodern commentary on the entire fantasy genre, but you started like in '91. How much of it do you still think holds, and do you think fantasy has actually progressed beyond what you were commenting on?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, everything is sort of produced in and of its time, and so it remains legitimate for when it was written. Whether I would approach things and try to say the same thing again, I don't know. I don't know. In some ways, for having written the series in a postmodern fashion, no, you can no longer comment on it because the creation of that series has negated the thing that it approached. You see what I mean? Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would be able to repeat any of that. And as for the modern fantasy now, it's not relevant because it's not part of that time.
So, I mentioned my favorite line from the novel. Always an even trade. That resonated with me so much, and it helped me define some personal stuff. And then, when I contacted you to come here, I've started to think about some things from the novels. And I started to think about you as a creator, and sort of like the process of creation is something like sorcery, isn't it? It has a certain magical aspect in creating all those different destinies and worlds and gods. And we, the readers, are sort of like common grunts in the army. You're the master tactician, the general, the strategoi. And we simply go where we are told to go and do what we are told to do, and we really do not have well, perhaps we do have a say if we decide to buy the book or do not, but if we join the army, if we buy the book, then that's it. And do you have any opinion on that contact between the reader and the creator, and do you have any, George Martin has a tremendous pressure by his readers, and there is a tangible, bond, and sort of like unveiling, sort of like what Mail did with the sea god, So do you ever feel that you're in that kind of a relationship, like a Kagel magician in the Malazan army, or like God with his faithful? Or do you feel oppressed by the readers?
No, not at all. Although I do respond every now and then. For example, I think it was partway through Memories of Ice, the third book, and some some review dropped it in front of me, and the review was basically saying, well, this guy keeps switching points of view, switching settings. He obviously, he can't stay in one place for any one time, stay with one character. And I remember reading that and thinking, you don't know crap, right? And so what it did was it actually led me to start the 4th book, House of Chains, and stay with one character for the entire 1st book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually responded to the criticisms. Basically saying, I can hold the point of view for as long as I choose.
But you do not have any sense of sort of social contract between you as a writer and the guys who buy your books?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a huge one. I'm asking you to invest in a lot of reading and a lot of time and a huge journey. And so I always sensed, that's why I always apologize for books, for the end of book 9 being a cliffhanger, because I, as a reader, hate cliffhangers. And so I wanted each novel to stand alone and deliver something at the end. And because they're big books, if you're going to invest in 300,000 words and however long that takes you to read, I'm going to do my damnedest to make it worthwhile in terms of the payoff at the end of the book. And then the pressure starts building for the entire 10-book series, that I wanted to make sure that at the end of the 10-book series, you all felt that it was worth your while to read it.
Did you have the same editors throughout the series?
No,
Was there any
no.
suicide?
Was it what?
Any suicide by your editors? I mean, the guys who were copywriting.
Oh, I had the same editor, yeah.
Yeah. You did, yeah?
Yeah, I trained him well. And I'll explain how I did that. When Gardens of the Moon came out, one of the things that, because I was writing as a Canadian and the idiom I was using was a North American idiom, I had to sort of make a switch over to British style. And so things where I was asked to put in a lot of stuff like the word lad and as opposed to boy and that kind of thing. So, and lass and all the rest. And I resisted it and resisted it all the way through. Eventually I worked my way back to what I learned at Iowa, for example, the writer's workshop, which was basically he said, she said. I wasn't attaching anything else to my style. And so I got to pare that back. But quite often, in the early versions or the early manuscripts, books 1, 2, and 3, Simon, my wonderful editor at Transworld, would come to me and say, well, this is a fairly long book. Can you cut out this section and this section and trim it out a bit? And I would just say, well, actually, that section is relevant in book 9. It comes back. And this one's really important in book 5. And so eventually he just threw up his hands and said, okay, I'm not touching this. And I wasn't lying, because in a sense I was setting things up.
Yeah.
And setting things up all the way through the entire series.
With translators are very used to stuff like that. So any questions? You had a question.
Yes, but
Okay. Here. And I'll remember it. So yeah.
Have you had an offer or any thought about the equalization of Mala's books, and having in mind that we are gathered here by Sakurabana Society, why not anime?
So, excuse me, please.
Can we get that one again? I didn't catch all that.
Have you had any thoughts about equalization of Mala's series, and having in mind that we are gathered here by Sakurabana, why not anime?
So animation series?
No, Sakurabana is a society of Serbian-Japanese friendship.
Okay.
And they are very dedicated to Japanese popular culture, such as manga and anime style of animation. And I guess that Berserker series can be... So
right.
Yeah, so...
well, as far as I know, the series is just... It was picked up... the translation rights were picked up in China maybe 5 years ago.
China?
Yeah. And Japan is probably maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So
recent.
Very recent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so so I couldn't even tell you what the sales are over there. So I don't know whether anybody's at all interested in animating this series.
We had a question. Yeah, you.
In my understanding, any serious writing is always something more than a storytelling. So if you had to define a drive, what propels you to write, what would it be? And if there's any general message you want to bring across, if you have to summarize it into 1 or 2 sentences, what would that be?
I've often described the Malazan, the 10-book Malazan series as a 3 million word long plea for compassion. And that is what the series is about. And that's why there are so many angles and so many points of view and so many sides to all these issues, which quite often in our world create a kind of a polarization that is really not useful for anyone. So I try to cover all of that. So yeah, I would say compassion is and it's essential for a writer anyways. You have to step into the shoes and wear the skin of other people. And once you do that, you can't go back. So you acquire empathy in some fashion or another.
Do you think, for, I don't know, the last 15 years, my favorite authors, my favorite genre authors were all Canadians?
Really?
Yeah. So up to 2003, my favorite author was George Martin. Then it was you. Then,
he's not Canadian.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
After that, the last 15 years or so, after that it was Steve Sterling with his Change series. And very recently, Miles Cameron. He writes historical novels by the name of Christian Cameron, and Miles Cameron is his fantasy pen name. So what I kind of noticed is that the Canadian authors are really very, well, not tangibly different than the American ones or the British ones, but they do, Australians are quite weird,
yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But the Canadian ones have a certain, I don't know, I really can't put my finger on it, that makes them kind of really unique, even when they're dealing with what is essentially a really, really well used up cliche, you know. So
well, you got also Charles DeLint.
Yeah.
Guy Gabriel Kay.
Yeah.
Canadian writers.
Yeah. So can you? I don't know.
Nella Hopkinson, another one.
Yeah. Can you? Why is that? I mean,
I don't know.
We tend to view North America as a one monolithic entity, you know. And,
mistake.
Yeah.
Big mistake.
And 2010, when Patrick Saint-Denis was here, the famous blogger, fantasy blogger, he told me that most Canadians think of themselves as the opposite of Americans and define themselves as that. And you're still subjects of the British Crown, right? So, or the Elizabethan head of state.
Yeah, well, there's the governor general.
Yeah, there's that whole monarchy thing. So, do you think that all of those bundles of issues in any way influence all of those Canadian writers who put up very different things, stylistically, emotionally? You know, you wrote 3 million words, Plea of Compassion, which is considered to be perhaps the seminal work of military fantasy. You know, I really can't think of an American author of military anything who would describe his work as a plea for compassion.
I don't know. Yeah,
is that a cultural thing?
I have no idea. I mean, one of the things as an archaeologist, I work primarily as a field archaeologist, so I spent a lot of time out in the bush or exploring landscapes and peeling back landscapes. And it gives you a different perspective on the passage of time and what cultures do when they evolve and when they rise and when they fall. And so that once you've got that long-term view, then it kind of relaxes you in the sense of the immediate crisis or tomorrow's crisis or the one that follows.
But does that induce envy?
I hope not.
You know, the whole, the Anumanda Rake and his people, I mean, his entire reason for existence for the last, I don't know, 200,000 years is to snap out his people out, out of their depression, in fact.
Yeah. Well, that was just one aspect that I was exploring with a long-lived species. It occurred to me that, yeah, they would have to fight that if you live that long. I remember an early draft of Gardens of the Moon where I tried to write from Rake's point of view and Amanda's point of view, and realized I could not do it because there would be no way to try to convey the sensibilities of somebody who's lived hundreds of thousands of years.
So Rake is ascendant, right? He's a knight in one of the houses. Was now. Yeah, so. But what? And he sort of has worshippers, but he does not reply to them. He does not give them spells. He does not. He's sort of an uncaring god, like Conan's Crone, you know. So was that intentional for you? Do they bug him? You know, when they pray to him? Is it sort of like getting text messages all the time that you do not want? What was in your mind when you made him essentially a god who, in fact, does not want to be a god?
An indifferent god.
Indifferent god.
Well, but that's part of what fantasy can do, is that dialogue with the real world. You know, the prayers that go unanswered, they exist in our world, as far as we can tell. And so in that sense, Rake is as non-responsive as
most
maybe
gods.
Yeah, most gods.
Yeah. So I had in book 1, when Rake descends from his citadel, and in his dragon form, there is change in gravity under his wings. I felt it like that. So it's almost, he's so dense with power that his descent cracks the ground under him. You know, and that was so. And the whole thing with the demon, who, as soon as he understood, you know, the threat of the sword of Beokon and Anamanda. So, you know, that is the kind of guy who cannot do anything without creating ripples all around him. And he's sort of like, I know, the ultimate power, you know, who must control himself at each and every paladin as well. And there are other characters, but with Rake it's the most